Welcome to the Week 12 overview for Managerial Economics here at Rutgers University in Camden. And this week's topics include Chapter 15, Asymmetric Information. The first section that the textbook goes over is adverse selection. Make sure you understand the definition of adverse selection and also what are the implications of adverse selection. Realize that because of adverse selection, not all desirable transactions take place, and it is quite possible that low-quality items will tend to be overrepresented in transactions that occur because of this. Also have a good notion of what the lemons problem is and how it is an example of adverse selection. And in particular, be aware of the impact of adverse selection in insurance markets. It's a big issue when it relates to insurance. Next, the chapter discusses how to reduce adverse selection. In particular, make sure you understand the fact that there can be laws that are put into place that limit the ability of people who have greater information versus the people with less information to exploit these information differences. Also realize the role that consumer screening, the provision of information of third parties, and how signaling by firms also impact or reduce adverse selection. Additionally, the chapter discusses moral hazard. Make sure you understand what moral hazard is, and in particular, make sure you understand the difference between adverse selection and moral hazard. Also, moral hazard is again another big problem in insurance markets, and has to deal with the principal-agent relationship when the agent, such as an employee, takes actions that the principal, such as the manager, cannot observe. Make sure you realize how contracts can be used to mitigate these issues. So you can have a contract between parties that's efficient and it maximizes the total profits of the parties and sharing risk optimally. Also, continuing with that, the chapter goes over the contracts and how contracts are used to reduce moral hazard. Make sure you realize that moral hazard problems can often be reduced or eliminated by using an appropriately designed contract that aligns the interests of both parties. So make sure you understand the importance of how contracts can be used to align the interests of parties. But realize that there's also a trade-off that by doing this, you can maximize total profit and efficiently reduce risk for both parties, but there's a trade-off that how detailed the contract is and the cost of implementing and enforcing that contract. Also realize some of the things that can be done to reduce moral hazard, for example, outcome-based contingent rewards, such as profit sharing, bonuses, commission, and piece rate payments, and how these reduce moral hazard. Also, the chapter discusses using monitoring to reduce moral hazard. Moral hazard can often be reduced or eliminated by monitoring and using a contract to penalize bad behavior. So you're going to monitor the individual or the institution and have it included in the contract and stipulate what penalties are going to occur. For example, if you're a company and you're hiring individuals, your employer might require an employee to post a bond, and if they shirk, steal, or otherwise do what they're not supposed to do, they forfeit the bond. In situations where the employee cannot afford a bond, the employer might use some type of deferred payments or efficiency wages. So make sure you understand the concepts of deferred payments and efficiency wages, particularly in helping to reduce moral hazard. The next chapter that's covered in this week is Government and Business, Chapter 16. And these are the particular areas that are covered in the chapter. So the first one's market failure and government policy. Remember that a perfectly competitive market achieves economic efficiency. It's going to maximize surplus. But when market failures occur, and we have imperfectly competitive marketplaces, total surplus is not maximized. Governments might take actions, for example, to engage in a Pareto improvement. That is a change that helps some people without harming anyone. An alternative approach to that is to choosing government policies with the cost-benefit principle. So make sure you realize the issue of market failures and how the government is attempting to improve efficiencies by regulating a particular market. Also in here, there's specifically discussions about regulation of imperfectly competitive markets. Governments will oftentimes use direct price controls or controlling other variables to reduce or eliminate market failures when there's market power present. Make sure you realize that if the maximum price allowed equals the marginal cost of market failure and associated deadweight loss are eliminated, provided the firms stay in business. If the ceiling price is set high at a higher level but below the unregulated monopoly price, the harm of the market failure is reduced but not eliminated. And also realize that regulators can try and attempt to do this, but they might not actually achieve this because of the fact that they don't have adequate information, particularly about supply and demand conditions. And also realize that there's this notion of regulatory capture, that the regulator acts in the best interest of the person or the industry that's being regulated and not the consumer. The chapter also discusses antitrust law and competition policy. So the government may choose, instead of regulating the non-competitive market, the government can use antitrust laws or competition policy to promote competition and prevent market failure from occurring. For example, companies can get together and price fix or engage in other cartel activities, so the government would try to prevent those types of behaviors. They might also try to influence mergers. They might have merger policy to prevent mergers that would be considered harmful to consumers, whereas there might be some lower costs associated with the merger, but that the impact on the consumer or the negative impact on consumer would outweigh that. Also, for example, be aware of predatory pricing policies that could occur. That's where firms will deliberately set low prices in order to drive a competitor out of business and then raise its prices after competition has been decreased or eliminated. Be aware of the issue of externalities, and that externality is a cost or a benefit that's imposed upon a third party that's not involved in the transaction. For example, an example of a negative externality would be pollution. Realize that because manufacturers do not pay for the externalities they create by producing pollution, their private costs of production are less than the full social cost. That includes the private cost and the externality cost. So realize the fact that they don't have to account for the cost of cleaning up that pollution. Their costs are much lower than the social optimal level. So realize that competitive markets produce more than the efficient output due to the negative externality, and this is what causes a market failure. The next section goes over open access, club, and public goods. Make sure you understand the difference between a private good, a public good, what is meant by open access, and what is meant by a club good. So make sure you understand the differences between those. There's subtle differences between all of those groups. Make sure you have a good understanding of each of those. And the chapter ends with intellectual property. Realize that information itself is a commodity, and that with this type of information, there's a free rider problem. So make sure you understand what the free rider problem is and how this relates to intellectual property. Realizing this, that when there's this free rider problem, people have little incentive for inventing new things or being innovators because other people can free ride off of their innovation and they will not accrue the profits, etc., from that innovation. So the impact of that and what government policies are put in place to try and mitigate that free rider problem when it comes from information. Realize that governments provide patents to individuals, copyrights, etc., to try and protect the creator so they can have some level of monopoly power during that time period. So realize that a patent itself is a monopoly on information, same thing as a copyright.